Hello, welcome back. Paul here. The topic at hand today is reader response criticism. This is a kind of an unusual literary theory, if you ask me. They're all unusual. They all are kind of weird things to have to go through, but this one I find particularly difficult. It sounds like it should be the easiest, but I find it kind of difficult. Um, Reader response theory or reader response criticism is a response to literature that you're reading, and it sounds on the surface like it's just your subjective opinion of what you've read, and you can't really be wrong, and that makes it really easy. But that's not really the case. There are wrong answers when it comes to interpreting things through theory, and I think that oftentimes especially students will kind of think that with literature in general, when there's an emphasis on interpreting literature, that means that they're using their own subjective experience and subjective opinions to interpret that literature, which means that there are no wrong answers. Well, that's not true. It's not a free for all of meaning, and you can't just use infinite creativity to make it mean what you want. There is a method you need to, there are many methods you can go through, but you need to use those methods in ways that will take you to a place of meaning that makes sense, that's viable. And you can have bad interpretations and wrong answers. And the same is true with reader response criticism. So you're not just reading something and then giving your opinion about it. What you need to do is you read a piece of literature and you have a response to it. You're going to have your own response to it, but then what you need to do is analyze your response. And by analyzing your response, you can understand what the encounter with the text means. So this takes us a little bit away from purely looking at the text like new criticism would, and it puts us more in the realm of thinking about the reader's experience with the text. So it's almost the opposite thing from did I say, I think I misspoke, new criticism. New criticism would be looking at just the text. This takes us away from that and looks at the person reading the text, or the psychology or the ideas of the person reading the text. So another way to do this, you don't have to do it just on yourself. You can see other people's reactions to text and analyze their responses. And then that can bring you an understanding of what an encounter between a particular person or reader is with a text. And that's something that's done pretty often too. Um, so the idea here is that what the text is inseparable from what the text does. So the text isn't just a thing that is written once and for all and has meaning. It's doing something to you, and there's an interaction between you and this text, and that is where the meaning is made. So the reader plays a role in the experience. The reader doesn't just consume meaning or discover meaning or understand what the text is telling them. The reader is using that text to have an interaction to create meaning. So again, that makes it sound like it can mean anything you want it to mean, but when we put these frameworks in place for analyzing literature, those frameworks have to do their work, and you have to do your work within those frameworks to come to maybe a variable interpretation, but it has to be one that follows the rules that make sense. So the text exists, but it is meaningless until somebody reads it. It's kind of like, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, doesn't make a sound. Well, in this case, that would be interpreted as this text does not make a sound until somebody reads it. That's when it comes into being. So different readers will bring different experiences and different cultural beliefs, different identities, and different personalities to the reading, and that will heavily affect how the interpretation is made. But the text as it's written still exists and has to be dealt with. So one way to think about this is the text is not an object. It's not, so when I'm looking at this text is not just a thing. This text is an event. So if you start to think about a text as an event that unfolds and comes into being and is interpreted while you read it, that'll take you a long way toward understanding this theory. In this particular book, Lois Tyson has an exercise in this chapter where she asks you to read a passage and take and read it differently, right? So she first wants you to read it from the perspective of somebody who is she kind of gives you a perspective. You're looking for real estate to buy and look for what is meaningful in this text and figure out what it means. And then she wants you to read it from the perspective of somebody who wants to rob the place or burgle the place, whatever the right word would be, right? And then see what the text means in that context. So that's like a beginner's way to start thinking about it, but that's kind of what we're doing here. There'll be two different experiences you have with that text. So the text itself isn't static. So Lois Tyson is really helpful in laying out different ways that you can do this reader response. She lays out, I think, 5 different specific theories on reader response, or methods, I should say, within this chapter. I'm going to talk about some of those. I mean, obviously, you'll be reading those yourself and getting what you need to get out of them, but I'm just going to give you a good idea of how you can think about this. You can use a combined approach when you're writing about literature here. So Tyson lays out separate methods to use. You can kind of use parts of multiple methods if you think that works, or you can use one method, or you can use one piece of one method. Mainly what you're going to be doing is using all the ideas in this chapter as a resource to do your own reading within the vein of reader response. So again, this is not just an objective opinion. This is a methodized personal interpretation, and it can be analyzed for consistency and for quality. Remember, sometimes you're analyzing somebody else's. That means that somebody else could analyze yours too. So you could have a reaction to a text, and a literary theorist could come along and theorize why you have made a poor interpretation of that text, but then figure out why you did that, right? So this is as much about the reader as is about the text, sometimes even more so, depending on what method you use. So here's a couple ideas from the text. So there's something that is a method that's called transactional theory or transaction theory. Louise Rosenblatt is a scholar who thinks a lot about this one. So this one I think is very straightforward, and I like this one a lot. So she talks about analyzing the text in a way that what you're looking at is the transaction between the text and the reader. The transaction is what creates meaning. So that's kind of like what I was explaining just generally about this method. So the reader brings their own personality, their own knowledge and beliefs and assumptions and everything to the reading. And then they're going to read the text and they'll experience it. So there was this experience they have is going to elicit some sort of reaction from them. But you have to keep in mind then that it's not just that you are imposing your beliefs and your ideas onto this text. It works the other way too. The text acts as a blueprint for you. So there is a set of words that are static on the page that they are doing something, right? And that's your blueprint. If you get too far off of this blueprint with your interpretation, that means that you're not following the blueprint. Your house is going to fall apart if you build it, right? So you might have to backtrack and revise your ideas a little bit and realize that you're not purely putting your ideas onto this text. This text is giving you a blueprint, and when you interpret it with your ideas, you have to make sure that you are honoring that blueprint. Otherwise, your interpretation is not very meaningful. So I really like this idea, and this is kind of the way I think about reading text anyway. Even before I knew about this method, that's kind of the way I approached it. So sometimes readers' interpretations will be wildly different. If you're practicing this method and you're learning the field and you're reading carefully and being responsible, there's going to be variations in these interpretations, but they're not going to be wildly different, except for when they're supposed to be. So this blueprint, so this author might write right into the blueprint things that are intentionally ambiguous, that intentionally have meaning that is uninterpretable, or that can be interpreted in lots of different ways. And in that way, the author's asking you to have wildly different ideas about it at some point, and that's part of what makes the book exciting. So this really has to do with the design of the text itself. Is it asking you to do this? Is it leading you to do this? There's this idea, but that you can differentiate between determinate meaning and indeterminate meaning. So a determinate meaning will be something that's just a fact in the text, the names of characters, things that actually happen in the plot, if they're straightforward. The actual vocabulary that's used, things like that, things that really can't be mistaken. You're just reading. If you're reading carefully, you can plainly see it. But then there's indeterminate meaning. Indeterminate meaning will be something like, well, what were the character's motives for doing this? What kind of mindset was that character in? How is this plot being hidden from me? Is the narrator dependable or not? What's being left out of the text that I'm not privy to that might affect what all this means, but I just haven't been able to get that information from the writer, the narrator? How does the sentence level lead me to expect certain things? Is there syntax that is causing me a discomfort because it's a little bit off? Are these sentences kind of creating expectations that are either fulfilled or not fulfilled? So I'm not talking about, does this story come to a conclusion that I expected? I'm talking more on the micro level. Are these sentences creating expectations and then maybe not fulfilling them? Is the word level and the sentence level of the excerpt that I'm looking at doing something to me and leading me to either believe something, to expect something, to feel a certain way, to understand or not understand, right? That's the kind of thing that you want to be looking for here. And that's how you end up being able to read, or, and you could write 25 pages on just a couple paragraphs of a book if you're contextualizing it and really getting deep into what that section is doing. Another idea that Tyson talks about in the book is affective stylistics. So again, in this idea, this idea really emphasizes that the literary text is an event, and it comes into being by being read. So examine the text closely, and we're talking line by line or word by word even, and try to understand how the stylistics are affecting your experience. So by stylistics, I mean, how are these sentences actually put together? What kind of vocabulary, what kind of syntax, what kind of grammar, all these kinds of things, what sorts of arrangements, right? So if you're looking at language at the micro level, you can see beyond just what it means, and you can see what it's doing. And this is something that I emphasize this in all my classes when it comes to literature. You really need to move beyond explaining what something means and start to explain what it does. This is going to carry over to some degree in all of your work if you want to be a serious student of literature and then a serious scholar of literature. The words on the page do something. So for example, the words on the page might be intentionally confusing. So don't confuse this with it being poorly written. Sometimes something can be very, very well written and lead you into mistakes or be very cryptic and hard to understand. Just because something is hard to understand doesn't mean it's good. But if there's something intentionally hard to understand, that can be some excellent reading experience for you, right? If you can just stick with it. The writing might unsettle you. It might unsettle you because of the topic being, expressed, and that's one thing. But it might also unsettle you because of the way it's structured. There are a lot of ways to cause sort of like an intellectual anxiety with the way sentences are put together. And that's why it's kind of important to know a little bit about grammar and to know about how sentences are structured when you're studying literature, because it's not just the subject that's being talked about, it's how it's being done with the art of language, right? So maybe there's a way that the sentences are being written where you kind of expect something, but then something else happens, right? I'm talking again at the micro level. You take a paragraph or something and study how that paragraph makes you expect something, and then whether or not that expectation is fulfilled, or maybe it takes you in a different direction. Things like that, right? Um, so literary theory really is done a lot of times at the micro level, and you should be getting accustomed to taking something. You have to read the entire text, read the whole story, read the whole poem, read the whole book, understand it well, and then figure out what moments in those pieces of literature are particularly impactful or particularly confusing or particularly infuriating to try to get through, and look very, very closely at them and think of them as microcosms of the book itself. When you are talking about the theme of a paragraph or the effect of a paragraph, what it does to you, you're not necessarily saying anything. Well, you're not necessarily talking holistically about what the book does. You're talking about that one part. But by understanding a small part, you're going to understand the larger part of it even better. So what if there's an inevitability of misunderstanding something? That means that the blueprint of this, to look back on one of the last method we're looking at, that means the blueprint or the structure that the author has set up is doing that to intentionally. Why? What's it doing? How is it doing that? Analyze that, the text is going to affect you in a certain way, and the most important thing here is that you need to understand why it makes you feel that way. Analyze your reaction. So you're going to be reading an excerpt, or you're going to be reading the entire chapter from O'Brien that I gave you. Read the whole thing, understand it well, so that you can, when you do look at a small part of it, you're not confused about the context of it. You need to know the context of it if you're going to be responsible about this, right? So if you read the O'Brien chapter and then pick out a part that you find is really impactful, a paragraph or two, look at it, react to it, explain what your reaction is, but more importantly, analyze what your reaction is, and try to figure out why the text affected you in the way that it affected you, and explain that with lots and lots of quotes at the micro level. Words, sentence parts, phrases, things like that, right? And explain exactly what those things are doing. Not so much what they mean, that'll be in the background. We'll understand what it means, but what are they doing? What's your encounter with it? How is that making meaning? I'm just going to talk a little bit more about, there's this idea of subjective reader response. Again, these can blend together for you a little bit if they're useful, but Tyson specifically talks about like 5 of them. I'm not going to go through all 5, but David Blake does this thing called subjective reader response. And he says that a text is defined as the symbolization of printed words. So what that means, you're going to have to get really used to thinking about things in terms of symbols in maybe a different way than you've thought before. In the last lecture, I kind of talked about that a little. As we go ahead, a symbol is largely going to mean language, right? A symbol of something is a representation of it, and we're talking about language. So in literary theory, the idea of language as a system of symbols is important. So if the text is something that's a symbolization of the printed words, what that means is we have real objects and we have symbolic objects, right? The real object is this physical book, the paper that it's on in the binding. This is the real object. But then we have the symbolic object. And the symbolic object is, I open this thing up, I read it, and I have an encounter with it, and I create meaning in my mind. So the idea here is that on some level, this is a text, just a physical text, right? But the text that we're worried about, that we want to think about, is the text inside my head or in my consciousness that I create by having an encounter with this book. So this is another thing, especially when we get into post-structuralism, which I keep talking about because I'm excited about it. But in general, we're going to have to be thinking in a complicated ways about what a text actually is. A text can be the book itself, but a text really is the thing, the meaning that we have created that we need to sort of analyze, right? So for Blake, what we're talking about here is the text that he's worried about is the symbolic text in your mind that was created through an encounter with this book. So the book itself isn't what we worry about anymore. It's the experience in the mind that is the actual text that we're worried about. Um, so this is just one of the many definitions of text. Text becomes a broad thing. And again, this is not a free for all for meaning. Our minds are subject to our own cultures, our own experiences, our own communities, and there's like governors on our minds in that way. And when we create a text in our head, it's an encounter that is heavily influenced not just by the written words, but also by the culture and society that we are sort of being conditioned in. Um, me, I, Tyson also talks about the psychological reader response theory. I could just touch on it. This one has a lot to do with the lecture you just had that was psychoanalysis. The idea here, this is Norman Holland, who was a big thinker in this, and he talks about how this one actually focuses more on the reader than on the book itself. And so, what does the interpretation of the text reveal about the reader themselves, right? Um, so you can see how this is attached to or kind of overlaps with psychoanalysis. So we all have psychological needs. We all have a subconscious, and we repress things. We repress experiences and thoughts into our subconscious, and that creates patterns in our actions. Right? It creates thought patterns, and it affects how we think about things. And we don't really know off the top of our heads what's affecting us. That's just the way we are. But if you dig down, you can see that we have core issues in us that are affecting us, right? So when you have an experience with a text and you read it and you have a reaction to it, that reaction, according to Holland, is a coping mechanism. So you have a certain reaction, whether you might have a reaction of fear or anger or indifference or sympathy, empathy, um, whatever kind of reaction you have to a situation. What if somebody's victimized in a text? How do you feel? Do you empathize with that person? Do you have a fear reaction, an anger reaction? Is it sort of indifferent because it's just part of the story? You're going to have a reaction, right? So, what kind of psychological factors are inside of you that cause that reaction? Um, so, how do you use reading as a coping mechanism by having that reaction, and what does it all mean? So this one, it could get sort of personal, and you never have to make a reading more personal than you want it to be, but it can be fun if you want to use this sort of psychological reading where what you would be doing is looking very closely at a text and having a reaction to it and analyzing that reaction in terms of what it is about you that caused you to have that kind of reaction to the text. Don't abandon the text when you're doing this. Don't make it all about you, but make sure that you're still using a lot of quotes of specific language from an excerpt of this. And this excerpt should be leading you toward some reactions and explain how the text itself elicited a reaction from you. And then you can explain what you think it is about you, about your psychology that caused you to react in that way. So you're still talking about the encounter you're having with the text, but you're focusing more on yourself. Or you can do this with another reader. You can look at somebody else's reader response and try to take that apart too. So in that way, this can be talking about a lot of stuff that goes outside the text because it's stuff that you're experiencing in your own mind. The text, then, remember, the text is the meaning that you've made in your mind as a result of the interaction with the paper text. So we're talking about a symbolic text in your mind that you're sort of reacting to. Don't forget, though, to use lots of quotes from the actual physical paper or screen text itself, the actual words. Don't abandon those. Don't just talk about your feelings. Make sure that you're focusing very heavily on the text and then explaining what it did to you, right? So you can use any combinations of all these things that I've talked about, and there's lots and lots and lots more in this chapter. You need to read this chapter. You can't just try to, use some words that I said and then create a theory out of it. I would like you to be developing real understandings of these theories. Again, I feel like this one is kind of difficult because it's sort of all over the place. But the main thing you need to do is examine your reaction to the excerpt that you choose. Use a lot of quotes and direct language from it to show and demonstrate that. You are going to be analyzing at the sentence level and at the word level, at the phrase level, to demonstrate how that's causing a reaction in you and analyzing that reaction. I think that as long as you're explaining that the text is doing something to you, you're going to be on the right track. Again, you're not explaining what this text means. You are in no way summarizing this. You have to have background contextualization of what it means and how it fits into the larger story. But this excerpt, you're going to be talking about what it does to the reader. You can be talking about yourself specifically, or you can be talking about the reader, as in like the ideal person to read this, who's not an actual person. You can choose which way you want to go about that, whichever way you think you can handle it the best. But you're going to want to talk about how beliefs, ideologies, cultural assumptions are interacting with the text to create meaning. Again, this video got a little bit on the long side, but there was so much to cover. I hope you find lots of useful stuff in it. Read the book carefully, come to more conclusions than I've given you, and have some fun with this one. Even though I think it's difficult, I think some other people think it's easier, and it could be a lot of fun for you. So see where it takes you, and I'll see you in the next video.